Hello, Faten.
Bonjour,
Bonjour, how are you?
ça va?
Fatenn Mostafa Kanafani, you are a lecturer and art historian focusing your research on Egyptian modernism in the 20th century. We also know you as the founder of Art Talks Egypt, which is an art space based in Cairo. This art space is dedicated to the management of Egyptian artist estates and the acquisition of modern Egyptian artworks by individuals and institutions. In 2016, you contributed to two important publications, Daughters of the Nile, Egyptian Women Changing Their World, edited by Samia Spencer, and the Catalogue Raisonné of modern Egyptian artist Mahmoud Said, co-written by Valerie Didihes and Dr. Hussam Rashwan. And I invited you to this conversation to talk about your research on modern Egyptian art and obviously your book entitled Modern Art in Egypt, Identity and Independence from 1850 to 1936, published in IB Tauris in 2020. So to start this conversation, I'd like you to explain us the time frame that you choose for the book from 1850 to 1936. To which stage of Egyptian art does this period correspond?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Arthur, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to talk to a key representative of what I believe is one of the groundbreaking private institutions in the Middle East or in the Arab world, the Dalloul Art Foundation. A few years ago, I contributed with an article in Rawi magazine, which is a heritage magazine in Egypt. And my article was specifically about the Dalloul collection, and it was titled Made in the Arab World. And it was quite a privilege to dig into that collection and of course to talk to the founder, the pioneering founder, Dr. Ramzi Dalloul, and to share with the public or the readers his vision really to tell the story of the Arab world, the complex story of the Arab world through art. So I hope to live and see the museum being inaugurated sometime in the near future, but with a collection that's almost 4,000 artworks. I think it really tells the comprehensive story of the Arab world. And it's not just an area of the world that is stuck into conflict. No, we have cultural innovators, we have something to say. And I think art, as Dr. Ramzi specifically chose to do so, art is one of the best soft means to say so. So thank you for the invitation. Now to answer you, maybe we start with a small anecdote. And I remember 11 years ago, that was in 2010, the idea of the book was really triggered. And I was in Dubai attending that famous auction where history was made when one of Mahmoud Said's paintings was auctioned at Christie's, and it sold for a whopping $2.4 million. And I remember standing, we were an Egyptian gang there, standing in euphoria, almost tears, crying and clapping because the result was unexpected, to be very honest, with an estimate of $150,000. Yeah. It skyrocketed to 2.4. And we were clapping and so on. And suddenly there is this lady who's a gallerist, and she whispers in my ear and she goes, "But who is this Mahmoud Said?" And at that moment, I realized that our story, the Egyptian story, needs to be told and documented. And of course, there is clearly at that point in time in 2010, a very big or a large void in English language publication specifically about modern Egyptian art. It's very difficult to find books that disseminate or tell the emergence of fine arts in the 20th century. So I said to myself, this is the project I want to dedicate the next few years. Little did I know that it would take 7 years to publish the first It took 7 years of research.
Yeah.
I am an economist by studies, by the way. So I studied economics, not art history.
Yeah.
I'm a self-taught art historian, to be very clear. So I'm an economist by studies. I'm a corporate person during my old life, but this passion for art has been there for quite some time.
Yeah.
To make that book happen, and I'll answer specifically why this period in a second,
Yeah.
I decided to build a certain archive because I wanted to tell our story from a local point of view and make it within the socio-political context. So this book is not just about art, but it is the linkage between, or the influence or the thread between the socio-political situation and how art played a role, if at all, there. Modern art in Egypt, the volume that you have is volume 1.
Yeah.
So my intention is to have 2 volumes. And this is why I approached it in a chronological way, and I chose to begin in 1850 and end in 1936. And I will explain that now. And volume 2 will start in 1936 and will end in 1973. If you look at each year that was chosen, it has a political reason. So 1850 is 1 year after the death of Muhammad Ali Basha. And we can go into more details here. And 1936 is the year, of course, of the Anglo-Egyptian Independence Treaty. Volume 2 will start from there and will end with 1973, which is one of the important wars that shaped the Middle East and still is shaping the Middle East. So the dates were intentional. You know, it's these dates could provide more than one book, you know. So I try to be as selective as possible and as partial as possible, because history can be told in many different ways. And history is always written by the winners. I cannot recall who wrote that, but I totally agree. So first, my objective was to provide a local interpretation of the emergence and dissemination of fine arts in Egypt. So it's a local perspective, not just a Western-centric point of view from somebody who is, you know, because you have to understand the politics and the religion and the society to be able to see how this all fits in. It's not a separate thing where you analyze just an art movement or an artist. It's a wholly picture. So as I said, I could have written a lot, but I had to stick to 120,000 words. So I cut a lot of the history and so on.
So you start your book by a chapter about al-nahda movement, which means Renaissance, which developed between 1850 and 1950. So can you tell us how this movement formed and what was its purpose? And here we have some main figures of this movement of al-nahda.
I love the images that you chose because they're actually telling quite the whole story, to be honest. Al-nahda is a beautiful word, you know. It's as you explained it or translated it, it's the culture. Nahda means renaissance, revival in Arabic. And it came to be attached to the cultural renaissance. And if we go slightly back, and that's why 1850, when Muhammad Ali Basha basically seized control of Egypt in 1805, he had one dream, one big utopia, which to turn Egypt into an advanced nation and build his own empire. But to do so, he was convinced that he needed engineers, architects, doctors, and so on, and put in place a whole program of education to have a team of people who can make his dream come true. So he began with, of course, the proliferation of schools, in addition to what existed already, which was the kutab. You know, young boys used to go to learn how to read and write and to learn the Quran by heart. But Muhammad Ali introduced schools, missionary schools, secular schools, by inviting foreigners, Westerners to come and open these schools. And he also pioneered the idea of what is called now La Mission Égyptienne, which is an Egyptian, which consisted basically of sending abroad Egyptian students to learn in the West. What he did not realize is that by trying to build architects and engineers and especially specialists in army, because he was dreaming of a big army, is that there would be a byproduct. And al-nahda, and I agree here with the historian Afaf Mursi Said, who said that actually al-nahda was a byproduct of the proliferation of this school and this education. He did not know that the outcome would also create a new league of cultural innovators and people who get exposed to a world that he was not interested in, actually. He just wanted an empire. So bottom line, al-nahda is an accidental byproduct of these measures that he took to build his empire. You know, it's not like he intended to do so.
Yeah.
And that's very important in our history. When he did that, and that leads me to some of the pictures you are showing, the one in the middle, not the left one, the left one is Rifa'a al-Tahtawi, but the one with a lot of individuals. These are actually members of the Egyptian population who were sent in the Mission Égyptienne. And I believe this is the 1826 mission that went to Paris. Yeah. And many of these gentlemen came back and took very important positions. But actually the most important player was the left figure, who is Rifa'a al-Tahtawi. He's a sheikh, so he's an Azharit, a religious man. And he was actually sent to chaperone these young men and make sure that they pray and they stick to the religious, religious steps, and they don't forget their identity or religious background. So he was there to be a guardian and as I said, make sure that they are proceeding with their prayers and so on. What's fascinating about this figure, who is now one of the most important, what we call modern reformists of Islam, is that he was probably the best outcome of the mission of 1826. And he is a very good example of an open-minded Islamic reformist who came back who took the best from the West and tried to implement it in the East. He came back with a lot of new notions at that time, and it's probably thanks to him that the concept of watan, nation, which we will see then later, especially amongst the artists, the concept of watan came or emerged. He explained what secularism means. He explained what nation, the concept of a nation, is all about. He translated over 2,000 important books from the West. And his influence is up until today quite important, you know. He was one of the first translators, as I said, and he introduced the public, the literate public, to a lot of different notions that did not exist at that time. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
So you said Rifa'a al-Tahtawi was so a sheikh, a religious figure. What was the place of Islam within the movement of al-nahda?
Religion has always played an important role, and it goes back to ancient pharaonic time, where even if it was multiple gods, there was religion, if you see what I mean. And if Akhenaten is the first one who introduced monotheism, religion could continue to play an important role. And you know, one of the reasons why, and that's my interpretation, the French the French invasion failed is that Napoleon Bonaparte could not understand the importance of Islam with Egypt. And that's why he was actually, to use a colloquial words, he was basically kicked out of Egypt, Napoleon and his army. The question was, at the time of this industrialization and building an empire, religion actually started to play a very advanced role, advanced in a very positive sense, is how it can become a pillar to reach that empire. And as any political leader today, Muhammad Ali and his followers, his dynasty, used the shuyukh or the imams as a means to get to where they wanted, you know, at the end of the day. So if they wanted to send a message to the Egyptian ordinary people, they used the imam to do so. But the positive thing or the good thing is that people like Rifa'a al-Tahtawi, and we will see later Muhammad Abduh, were open-minded and very keen to build an independent sovereign nation that is ready to cope with the civilized world. They used religion and interpreted the Quran in a way that supports that, you know. So that I hope answers your question as to what the
Imam Sheikh Muhammad Abduh that we can see here on the presentation. And next to him, we have the nationalist leader, Saad Zaghloul.
Muhammad Abduh is one of those fascinating figures, honestly. So is Saad Zaghloul on a political, but as we stick to Islam, you know, there is a whole chapter that I dedicated to religion, the importance of religion or the role of religion during that time frame that I'm discussing in this volume, because I think it's important. And again, the book is in English. Once it's translated in Arabic, it might open a lot of conversations with the local religious leaders. But Muhammad Abduh is one of those figures who devoted his life towards independence and shaping an Islam, as he said, that fits the times, And I think that's an element that, should there be a new Muhammad Abduh today, the area might look very different. And I encourage you to read that chapter, but also to read a lot more about what he wrote and what his thoughts were, be it about fine arts, about women, about polygamy, about education, about the importance of a nation, which later on will be completely the opposite, for example, of the concept of the Muslim Brotherhood, who looked more at a regional Islamic area rather than an independent state, nation state. And Muhammad Abduh encouraged that and was very forceful about it. Saad Zaghloul, both of them important figures. Saad Zaghloul changed the history of Egypt, in my opinion. Single-mindedly, he changed the history of Egypt with his determination to achieve independence. And it's interesting because a lot of, it's not just for Saad Zaghloul, but a lot of Western scholars will look at the period that I'm analyzing in volume 1 as being led by those rich land-owning families who cared less about ordinary people. Saad Zaghloul is a very good example. Yes, a peasant of a peasantry origin, but he really was there to create a nation for everybody, and a nation that embraces everybody, and forcefully fighting British colonialism while supporting education and fighting the British to make sure that the new university is built, the fine arts university is built. When I say the new university, it's Cairo University, really, which opened 6 months after the Fine Arts University in 1908. So I like the selection that you've made of those two key reformists of al-nahda movement, both great supporters of the art. Remember that Muhammad Abduh died before the Fine Art School opened. However, what he wrote, I still believe was a key factor in paving the way for accepting arts as non-Islamic, as an Islamic accepted by Islam, you
By
know.
Islam, yeah. Talking about the School of Fine Arts, so Prince Youssef Kamal was part of the royal family in Egypt and was also known to be a scholar. He was a great collector of Oriental antiquities and Islamic artworks. And as you said, in May 1908, the École Égyptienne des Beaux-Arts opened in Cairo. And Prince Youssef Kamal was at the origin of this project, and that he even founded in his personal funds, as you wrote in your book. But why was it important for the prince to institutionalize art education in Egypt?
Prince Youssef Kamal, you see, as we go through the different figures that you are choosing, you might hear a word that I repeat consistently, maybe because I'm fascinated by this period. He's one of the important figures that prove many wrong. Yes, he is from the royal family. He was a contender to the throne. Had there been, you know, the death of several people, this gentleman would be the king, or, you know, the sultan at that time. Okay. Many would finger point to a political agenda so that his name remains in history as the one who founded this school. But I think it was driven primarily by his belief in the potential of local Egyptians. You have to remember that in 1908, especially during the late 19th century, there were annual exhibitions, which primarily 99.9% were displaying paintings and artworks by Orientalist and Western artists. When he looked at the neighboring city of Constantinople, he took it as a model and tried to replicate this model of having a local fine art school to teach and nurture local talents. He put his money on the line. He fought a lot of local wealthy Egyptians who didn't believe that Egyptians could become painters, or that it would be actually wrong for Islamic reasons, or that they did not have the taste to do so. So he challenged that perception, and he found himself alone and hired Guillaume Laplane, as you mentioned correctly, to basically become the first director to establish that school. Not only did he give funds, but he also donated one of his palaces in Dar Gamelif to open that school. If we look today, we owe to him that first step, regardless whether there was a hidden agenda of putting his name in a political context or not. It doesn't matter. What matters is that once it opened, hundreds of people, the number varies depending on the source, but hundreds of native Egyptians rushed to the school to understand and to subscribe and to learn art, you know?
Yeah. And so next to the
Youssef Camel,
Youssef Camel, we have the Italian painter Camillo Innocenti.
Yeah.
So Guillaume Laplane was the first director of the Egyptian School of Fine Arts in Cairo, and he hired European instructors who were already living in Egypt, so such as the Italian painter Camillo Innocenti. And you wrote in your book that, I quote, "The foreign instructors had monopolistic decisions over the management of the school and the future of the student. This included blocking a native from heading the school." Why this management was problematic for Egyptian art students?
I wouldn't say problematic, but we have to also, one point that is important to stress here is that the fine arts school, l'École Égyptienne des Beaux-Arts, as well as the University of Cairo, both opened in 1908, which is exactly 1 year after the departure of Lord Cromer. And why is that important is because for years during the time where he was in Cairo, the British and specifically Lord Cromer fought against proliferating education amongst Egyptians.
Yeah.
Without going into depth, I think I spent quite some time in the book to tackle that and to address that issue. But a year after he left, both institutions opened, financed by wealthy land-owning owners, you know?
Yeah.
And that's important to put it in a context, is that they really tried to defy British colonialism and believed in education. Now, Prince Yusuf Camel didn't have much choice at that point in time, so he hired Guillaume Laplane, who already was in Cairo. He stayed the director of the school for a good decade, and he was followed by two others, amongst them Camillo Innocenti, who was also the director for a whole decade. And between Innocenti and Laplane, there was Gabriel Biassi, who was a Frenchman, who also was a director for another decade. I'm rounding the number. So for a good 30 years, for 3 decades, the school was run primarily by 3 foreign artists, 2 French and 1 Italian. The departments, the sub-departments were also headed by foreign artists, Forcella and many others. Yeah. And that was because there was a lack of availability of locals to manage that, at least during the first decade, you know. However, from the different archives, and keep in mind, I mentioned to you, I put a lot of effort building a very good archive. And the more you read, in addition to the public archives that are available, of course, it was clear that the Foreign League was basically trying to keep a monopoly because it was a very prestigious, very well paid job, and as well to teach Egyptians the Western way of painting or sculpting, the academic way of doing so. And if you read the book, the biography of Raghib Ayed, which I think is fascinating and very eye-opening, the year Muhammad Nagy became the first native Egyptian to be the director, Raghib Ayed called it a coup d'etat. Yeah. And he called it coup d'etat, how would you translate that? A revolution, that finally an Egyptian has become appointed the director, and finally we can take control and Egyptionize that school. Why so? If you read the objectives that Laplane put, he primarily focused on building, on training Egyptians on the pillars of the French Academy. He did mention the ancient Egyptians and the multi-layered identity of Egypt, but it was somehow a side or sub-objective. And the more Egyptians traveled abroad and studied abroad, in the context that I'm discussing, they wanted to come back and basically join forces to build that nation that I'm talking about, this nation identity of independence and sovereignty, and build an authentic Egyptian identity. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Muhammad Nagy was the first one, and it took quite a while to get there.
So since the opening of the Egyptian School of Fine Arts, the artistic landscape in Egypt changed quite a lot, and the country became an important cultural place in the Arab world. The pioneer generation of Egyptian artists had great ambitions for the arts in their country, but not only artists. You also talk about this important figure, Fouad Abdel Malik, who is the founder of the Salon du Caire, and who was not an artist.
George Fouad Abdel Malik is one of these figures that are overlooked or underestimated, really, in the annals of modern Egyptian history. His legacy is one that needs to be much more documented and researched. There is unfortunately not a lot about his achievements, which are extraordinary in my opinion. He's Egyptian. He studied in France and he studied in Germany. And at a certain point in time, he decided in around 1918, he decided to come back to Egypt. he's an industrialist, and he followed what he called the call of the nation and returned to Egypt to participate in the building of that new Watan. So he came back and he established his own industry. He used to have, he founded something called Fouad and Company, and later it was called Dar al-Fanoun, Le Palais des Beaux-Arts, where he actually was selling furniture and other things, but he transformed it into a space to promote arts and to exhibit artists. And from there on, he was the first one to start a collective exhibition. And La Société des Beaux-Arts from then on was born. It's thanks to Georges Fouad Abdel Malik. You have to remember that the last documented exhibition was in 1906 by something called Le Cercle Artistique, the Artistic Circle. And from 1906 until the first exhibition of La Société des Beaux-Arts, there was, at least from what I could see, there was not many events related to art. I couldn't find anything really specific. So Georges Abdel Malik, when he came back to Egypt, he basically was a philanthropist and put his money as well on the line and started to do those exhibitions and created a collective atmosphere of yearly exhibition sponsored by elite women, by different wealthy political, and we can go into details. For example, this picture you have here of l'inauguration du Palais des Beaux-Arts. Of course, it's a much later thing, but you see Prince Yusuf Camel, you see Mahmoud Khalil standing. They're all waiting to open. It was the vernissage, the type of vernissage at that point in time, and they're waiting for King Fouad to come and open the exhibit. Yeah. You know, so it was the politicians saw art as the means to basically shape this advanced nation that they dreamt of, really.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you tell us the objectives of the Société des Amis de l'Art?
I think is to herald Egypt into a new era and use art as one of the tools. There were a lot of tools, you know, as one of the tools to herald Egypt to an era of nationalism, sovereignty. It's a way of fighting this colonialism and to progress. So he wanted to create artists, he wanted to create social players, he wanted to create and build taste and an audience to appreciate art. And he did succeed in that. History tells us that he did succeed in that. Because up until today, this society exists, by the way, in a much smaller, less influential role. But until the late 50s, it was the most important society to shape artists or create artists and to shape taste.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in the first decade of the 20th century in Egypt is also marked by archaeological discoveries, such as the buste of Nefertiti in 1912. Mm-hmm. Can we say promoting Egyptian ancient art in Egypt served the nationalist cause when the country was still under the political influence of Great Britain?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you have to realize that with the excavations and the different discoveries, it was a revelation for ordinary Egyptians to discover their ancient past, which they couldn't for a long time, which they maybe neglected or ignored or did not understand. And as those discoveries came to light, the past became more accessible and understandable. You know, Khidewi Ismail opened several museums to the public. Egyptologists started to become native Egyptians. The language started to be understood, with the Rosetta Stone being understood. So slowly Egyptians started to appreciate and wanted to restore that glory back. Fascinating story where you had all different countries sending their own archaeologists to take a share of the pie, you know, the French, the British, even the Germans, they were all fighting to excavate and take some of these fascinating discoveries back home. One good example is Nefertiti, and for a whole decade, it was hidden in Germany until it was put into public display, to the horror and the shock of Egyptians. Now, this discovery and making ancient Egypt accessible was one of the key tools used by the first generation of artists, even up until today, by the way, but artists as a means to restore that glory and to differentiate themselves from Orientalists and Western artists. And they did that, in my opinion, brilliantly, each in his own individual way. And we will see it, the way Mahmoud Said or Raghib Ayed or Nagy, the three were influenced or inspired by ancient Egyptian art, but the outcome is significantly different. Three different art schools were built by these three artists. So actually, you know, just to give you examples, in the Arabic press, of course, the Francophone as well, but in the Arabic press, almost every week, the headline or the front cover was related to discoveries of ancient Egyptian art. And I'm just showing here one example from 1925. I can give you weekly example almost. I'm a bit exaggerating, of course, but a lot of examples of covers of magazines, not just al-Musawar, different magazines that celebrate those discoveries. Okay.